Charleston, South Carolina, 1844. A humid summer night hung heavy over the sprawling plantations like a suffocating veil. Lanterns flickered in the slave quarters, while the grand plantation mansion stood tall in eerie silence. To the outside world, this was a place of wealth, power, and control. But beneath that polished surface, something far darker was brewing. That night, 5 of the most powerful plantation owners in Charleston gathered, men feared by enslaved people, respected by elites, and protected by law. They believed they were untouchable. They believed history belonged to them. But history had other plans. By dawn, all 5 men were gone. No struggle recorded, no bodies found, no witnesses willing to speak. Only abandoned chairs, half-burned candles, and footprints that led into the darkness and vanished. Some said it was rebellion. Others whispered of vengeance beyond the grave. Still others believed a forbidden secret bound them together, a secret so terrible it consumed them all. For nearly 2 centuries, the truth has remained buried beneath Charleston's soil. Tonight, we revisit the night that changed everything, the night power disappeared without a trace. If stories like this send chills down your spine, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a hidden history. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Your city, your country, your story matters here. Charleston in 1844 was a city that shimmered in daylight, yet rotted beneath its own shadows. Spanish moss draped from towering oak trees like torn funeral cloth, swaying slowly in the humid Atlantic breeze. Grand plantation mansions lined the outskirts of the city, their white pillars gleaming while the ground beneath them trembled with suffering. Wealth was displayed openly in horse-drawn carriages, lavish banquets, and marble staircases, but that wealth was built on broken backs, silent screams, and erased humanity. By day, church bells rang, markets bustled, and gentlemen tipped their hats. Yet by night, the air carried the stench of fear that no perfume could mask. The economy of Charleston thrived on cotton, rice, and the relentless labor of enslaved people who worked from dawn until their bodies could no longer stand. Fields stretched endlessly like green oceans, but beneath their beauty lay chains of oppression. Plantation owners walked proudly, believing themselves chosen by God to rule, while enslaved families were torn apart like discarded property. Children grew up knowing the crack of a whip before they ever heard a lullaby, and mothers buried their grief deep inside their chests to survive another day. The city functioned like a machine powered by human suffering, yet its elites refused to acknowledge the blood fueling their prosperity. Social hierarchy in Charleston was rigid, brutal, and unforgiving. At the top stood the wealthy white planters, ruling not only land, but laws, courts, and religion itself. Beneath them were merchants, overseers, and lower-class laborers who still benefited from the system of bondage. At the very bottom were enslaved Africans and their descendants, treated as commodities rather than people. Their lives were governed by curfews, punishments, and constant surveillance, yet beneath their silence simmered quiet resistance. Charleston appeared orderly on the surface, but tension flowed through it like an invisible undercurrent waiting to erupt. Religion played a strange and haunting role in this society. Churches preached obedience and divine order, claiming slavery was justified by scripture. Plantation owners sat in polished pews on Sundays, praying for prosperity while owning human beings. Meanwhile, enslaved people gathered secretly in hidden places, whispering prayers for freedom, justice, and survival. They spoke of spirits, ancestors, and a higher power that saw their pain. In this contrast, Charleston became a battlefield between false holiness and suppressed truth, where morality was twisted to serve cruelty. At night, the city transformed into something far darker. Lanterns flickered weakly along dirt roads, casting distorted shadows that seemed to breathe. From distant plantations, the faint sounds of singing drifted through the trees, carrying sorrow, longing, and coded messages of hope. Patrolmen roamed the streets with rifles, terrified of rebellion, yet pretending to be in control. The river reflected moonlight like broken glass, while the silence felt heavy enough to crush a soul. Charleston after sunset was not peaceful. It was restless, haunted, and dangerously fragile. Rumors of resistance were whispered in both the slave quarters and the grand parlors of planters. Stories of escapes, secret meetings, and spiritual warnings spread like wildfire through the night. Some plantation owners dismissed them as superstition, while others secretly feared retribution for their brutality. The memory of earlier revolts lingered in Charleston's history like an unhealed wound. Every creak of wood, every distant footstep, and every flicker of flame reminded the powerful that their control was built on fear, not consent. By 1844, Charleston stood on a knife's edge between illusion and collapse. Its beauty masked deep corruption, its wealth hid unimaginable cruelty, and its silence concealed years of suppressed rage. The city was both a throne of power and a tomb of broken lives, where justice was absent and survival demanded endurance beyond human limits. Jonathan Mercer was spoken of in hushed tones long before the night of the disappearance. His plantation, Willow Bend, stretched for miles along the Ashley River, wrapped in beauty that hid relentless brutality. Mercer was educated in England, polished in speech and terrifying in practice, ruling his land like a silent tyrant who rarely raised his voice, but whose presence alone made men tremble. Enslaved workers described him as cold, calculating and merciless, keeping meticulous ledgers not only of crops, but of punishments. He believed discipline was sacred and viewed compassion as weakness, walking through his fields with a cane carved from dark ebony, while overseers followed like obedient shadows. To Charleston's elite he was respected, but to those he owned, he was a living nightmare dressed in silk. Samuel Hargrove of Blackwater Estate carried a different kind of cruelty, one that thrived on spectacle rather than silence. Unlike Mercer, Hargrove delighted in public displays of power, holding lavish gatherings while punishments occurred in full view of the enslaved population. His plantation was known for its relentless labor demands, where men and women worked until their hands bled and their spirits broke. Hargrove kept a private cellar beneath his mansion, rumored to hold secrets no one dared to discuss openly. Some said he experimented with methods of control beyond physical force, weaving fear into the very air of his land. His laughter echoed through Charleston's social halls, yet it carried a chilling undertone that made even fellow planters uneasy. William Ravenswood controlled Ravenswood Fields, a sprawling rice plantation built on swamps that swallowed both bodies and memories. He was older than the others, grey-haired and shrewd, having inherited his land through generations of exploitation. Ravenswood presented himself as a traditional gentleman, devoutly religious and outwardly restrained, yet his punishments were said to be the most calculated of all. He believed suffering was necessary to maintain order, and his overseers enforced his will with mechanical precision. Enslaved people whispered that Ravenswood spoke to himself at night, pacing his veranda as lanterns flickered like restless spirits around him. To Charleston society, he was untouchable lineage, but to those beneath him, he was a relic of relentless oppression. Elias Thornton of Silver Marsh was the youngest of the five, yet no less feared. Unlike the others, he sought innovation in control, introducing new tools and systems that increased productivity while deepening suffering. His plantation was run like a factory disguised as farmland, where every movement of the enslaved population was monitored and recorded. Thornton was ambitious, ruthless, and obsessed with expanding his influence beyond Charleston into neighboring territories. He often spoke of progress and prosperity, but his definition of both rested on human bondage. Many believed he was secretly involved in illegal trading and shadow dealings that connected Charleston to darker global networks of exploitation. Marcus Caldwell ruled over Red Cypress Plantation, a place surrounded by dense woods that seemed to swallow sound itself. Caldwell was known for his volatile temperament, shifting from charm to cruelty in moments. He maintained strict isolation on his land, rarely allowing outsiders to witness how his estate operated. Stories circulated of disappearances among enslaved workers who dared to question his authority, though no official records ever acknowledged them. Caldwell valued loyalty above all else and punished even the slightest perceived disobedience with terrifying intensity. His plantation felt less like a working estate and more like a fortress ruled by fear. Together, these five men formed an informal circle of power that shaped Charleston's economy, politics, and social structure. They attended the same churches, shared the same dinner tables, and protected one another's interests with unbreakable solidarity. Their influence extended far beyond their plantations into courts, councils, and trade networks. To challenge one of them was to challenge the entire structure of Charleston itself. Yet beneath their unity lay hidden rivalries, secrets, and unspoken guilt that bound them together in ways no one fully understood. By 1844, the reputations of these five owners had woven a dark legend across the region. Enslaved communities spoke of them not as men, but as forces of nature, shaping destinies with cruelty and control. Some believed they were cursed, others that they were invincible, and many simply feared them beyond words. Their wealth gleamed in the daylight, but their legacy was written in pain that echoed through fields, rivers, and slave quarters alike. The gathering that night did not resemble any ordinary meeting of Charleston's elite. Invitations were never sent, yet every one of the five men knew exactly when and where to arrive. Willow Bend's old riverfront lodge had been chosen, a wooden structure that stood slightly apart from Mercer's main estate, half hidden behind towering cypress trees. The path leading to it was dimly lit by hand-carried lanterns that flickered violently in the thick summer air. Servants were instructed to keep their distance. Overseers were dismissed early, and even the most trusted guards were told to remain beyond the tree line. From the very beginning, the atmosphere carried a sense of secrecy so heavy it felt almost visible. Inside the lodge, the room was arranged in a perfect circle, something unusual for men accustomed to sitting at the head of a table. A single large oil lamp hung from the ceiling, casting wavering shadows across the wooden walls. The floorboards creaked under their polished boots as they entered one by one, refusing to make eye contact with anyone except Mercer. No laughter, no pleasantries, no casual conversation passed between them, only brief nods that hinted at shared knowledge. Maps lay spread across a worn table, marked with strange symbols that did not resemble any official land survey. The air smelled of river water, burning wick, and something faintly metallic that no one acknowledged aloud. Mercer stood near the window, staring out into the darkness before speaking. His voice was low, controlled, and colder than ever, as though he feared being overheard by the night itself. Hargrove paced slowly behind him, running his fingers along the rough timber walls while his boots tapped in an unsettling rhythm. Ravenswood remained seated, hands clasped tightly around a silver walking stick, his knuckles pale beneath the dim light. Thornton leaned over the maps, tracing lines with a gloved finger, while Caldwell stayed closest to the door, scanning the tree line like a predator on edge. Their position suggested unspoken roles, yet none of them appeared fully at ease. Whispers of the meeting had already drifted through the enslaved quarters hours earlier, carried by distant sounds of hoofbeats and rattling carriages. Some said they heard strange chanting from the river. Others claimed the wind carried fragments of heated arguments. A few brave souls watched from afar, hidden behind brush and shadows, noting how even the usual night insects fell silent as the men gathered. The lodge seemed to draw the darkness inward, swallowing sound and light alike. From outside, the glowing windows looked less like shelter and more like the burning eyes of something watching back. As the discussion began, tension thickened between the five owners. Fragments of words slipped through the thin walls, references to old debts, buried truths, and an event that had occurred years before. At times their voices rose, then dropped suddenly to whispers that could not be deciphered. Hargrove slammed his hand against the table once, making the lamp sway dangerously overhead. Ravenswood murmured a prayer that sounded more like an incantation than a blessing. Mercer's face remained unreadable, yet his breathing grew heavier with every passing minute. What made the gathering truly unsettling was not just their behavior, but the absence of any official purpose. No trade deal, no legal matter, no plantation business required all five men to meet in such isolation. Even their most trusted allies were kept in the dark. The maps, the symbols, the secrecy, and the tension suggested they were confronting something far beyond ordinary politics. Outside, the river lapped against the shore in slow, deliberate waves, as if it too were listening to their every word. By late night, candle wax dripped like melting skin onto the wooden table, pooling beside the marked maps. The men moved closer together now, their voices barely audible, their silhouettes flickering against the walls like trapped spirits. Shadows stretched and twisted around them, merging into one dark shape that seemed to breathe with the room. Somewhere in the distance, a faint sound echoed through the trees, neither human nor animal, lingering just long enough to make every man inside pause. The last living person known to have seen the five men together was an elderly enslaved ferryman named Amos, who worked the narrow river crossing near Willow Bend. He later recounted that the night air felt wrong long before the lodge lights appeared, as though the water itself had grown restless beneath his small boat. From his position on the bank, he watched Mercer's carriage arrive first, wheels grinding slowly through mud, followed by the others in tight procession with no servants riding alongside. Amos noticed that the horses refused to drink from the river and kept pulling their heads away as if sensing danger. When he attempted to move closer, a sudden chill forced him to stay rooted in place, his lantern trembling in his hands while the lodge windows glowed like distant embers through the cypress trees. Near the slave quarters of Willow Bend, a young woman named Lila had been tending to a dying fire when she heard heavy footsteps on the path that led toward the river lodge. She later described how the sound of boots seemed to echo twice, as if another presence walked alongside each man without being seen. From behind a broken fence, she caught glimpses of dark silhouettes passing between the trees, their shapes stretching unnaturally in the wavering lantern light. At one point, she claimed the shadows detached from their bodies and slid across the ground ahead of them, making her drop her basket in silent terror. No one dismissed her account, because others had felt the same unease rippling through the night. Two overseers stationed near the main house reported seeing strange flickers around the lodge windows long after the men had entered. They said the light did not behave like normal flame, shifting from bright gold to sickly green without any visible cause. At times, they believed they heard murmurs drifting through the trees, then sudden bursts of raised voices that cut off abruptly. One overseer admitted that when he tried to move closer, his horse reared violently and refused to proceed, its nostrils flaring in panic. Both men stayed where they were, gripping their rifles, yet neither dared to advance toward the building that seemed to pulse with its own living breath. Along the riverbank, a patrolman making his nightly rounds noticed something equally disturbing. He later stated that the water beneath the lodge reflected the hanging lantern as a warped, trembling glow that multiplied into 5 separate lights beneath the surface. He claimed he saw movement deep below, like figures drifting slowly in the current, though no bodies were present. When he shouted toward the lodge, his voice was swallowed by the trees without even an echo returning. Shaken, he retreated toward the city road, convinced that stepping any closer would mean never coming back. Inside the main plantation house, a domestic servant named Clara remained awake far past her usual hour, drawn by an uneasy silence that settled over the property. She heard the distinct sound of chairs scraping against wood from the direction of the lodge, followed by what she described as heavy breathing that did not belong to any one man. At one moment, she swore she heard Mercer's voice rise sharply, then dissolve into a low murmur that felt less like speech and more like chanting. When she glanced out the window, the path toward the lodge appeared empty, yet the lantern light still burned steadily in the distance. Another witness, a boy no older than 12, was hiding near the marsh when he saw a final, chilling movement around the lodge. He claimed that just before midnight, 5 tall shadows stepped onto the small porch, standing motionless for several seconds. Instead of facing outward, they turned toward one another, forming a tight circle that blocked all view of their faces. The boy insisted that during this moment the surrounding trees bent inward as if leaning to listen, and even the crickets fell silent. After that, he dared not look again, crouching low in the reeds until his body shook from fear. By the time dawn began to pale the eastern sky, not a single living witness could clearly say when or how the men vanished. Some remembered seeing faint lantern lights still glowing near the lodge, others recalled hearing a distant splash from the river. What everyone agreed on was the overwhelming sense that the 5 owners had not simply left, but had been drawn away by something unseen. When workers approached the lodge hours later, they found only empty chairs, cooling wax, and the lingering impression that whatever had happened that night had taken more than just human lives with it. When morning light finally crept over the horizon, Willow Bend did not awaken like a normal plantation. The birds refused to sing, the river lay unnaturally still, and an uneasy quiet settled over every field and cabin. Workers approached the river lodge cautiously, half expecting to see their masters still inside discussing affairs of power. Instead, they found the door standing wide open, its wood splintered as though pushed from within by something desperate. The lantern still hung from the ceiling, flickering weakly, its flame bending as if pulled by an invisible force. Inside, 5 empty chairs surrounded the table where maps lay scattered, marked with strange symbols that seemed darker than they had the night before. No signs of struggle were present, yet nothing about the scene felt peaceful. Cups of untouched coffee sat cooling beside half-burned candles that had melted into twisted shapes resembling hands reaching upward. Footprints covered the wooden floor, but they moved in chaotic patterns rather than a clear path to the door. Some led toward the river wall, then vanished completely as if their owners had stepped into thin air. The air inside the lodge carried a metallic scent mixed with wet earth, making even the bravest workers gag. It was as if the men had not left, but had been removed from reality itself. Outside, along the muddy riverbank, fresh impressions were found, leading straight toward the water. These were not simple boot prints, but deep, uneven marks that looked as though something heavy had dragged 5 bodies across the ground. Yet when searchers scanned the shoreline, no clothing, no blood, and no belongings could be found. The river glistened under the rising sun, reflecting the sky like polished glass, betraying no evidence of what had occurred beneath its surface. Boats sent out to search found nothing but swirling currents that seemed to resist every oar stroke. Within hours, panic rippled through Charleston. Overseers reported that several enslaved workers had vanished as well, though records were unclear whether this was coincidence or deliberate escape. Plantation houses stood eerily silent, their masters absent, their authority suddenly meaningless. Servants whispered that the lodge itself had become cursed, claiming that anyone who entered could still hear faint murmurs drifting through the walls. Some swore they saw flickering figures standing inside long after the building had been abandoned. Officials arrived by midday, attempting to impose order on chaos they barely understood. They searched the grounds thoroughly, interrogated witnesses, and recorded statements that contradicted one another at every turn. No evidence pointed to a human crime, yet no proof supported anything supernatural either. Horses belonging to the 5 men were found trembling near the stables, saddles still strapped, but reins torn loose. Even trained tracking dogs refused to approach the river's edge, whining and pulling away in terror. As dusk fell again, the disappearance took on an even darker tone. Those living closest to the lodge claimed they heard distant splashing and low groans rising from the water, though no boats were visible. Lanterns placed along the path mysteriously went out one by one, as if the night itself was swallowing light. Some workers packed their belongings and fled into the marshes, convinced that whatever had taken their masters was not finished. Others remained, paralyzed by fear and uncertainty. By the second morning, it was clear that the 5 plantation owners had not simply vanished, but had been erased. No trail led to freedom, no sign pointed to murder, and no body surfaced from the river. Charleston's powerful men had disappeared in a manner that defied logic, law, and faith. The lodge stood empty, the river flowed silently, and the plantations waited in a tense limbo where control had evaporated without explanation. Some believed the disappearance was the result of an organized revolt planned in absolute secrecy. According to this theory, enslaved people from multiple plantations had communicated through coded songs, river crossings, and nighttime gatherings beneath the trees. They may have lured the 5 owners to the lodge under false pretenses, using fear, deception, and spiritual ritual to weaken them before acting. Supporters of this idea pointed to the strange symbols on the maps and claimed they were markers for escape routes or hidden burial grounds. In this version of events, the men were captured, transported silently across the marsh, and erased before dawn, proving that power had finally been challenged from below. Another widely whispered explanation involved a secret society that operated in the shadows of Charleston's elite. Some claimed Mercer, Ravenswood, Hargrove, Thornton, and Caldwell were not only plantation owners, but members of a clandestine brotherhood bound by blood oaths. This group allegedly dealt in illegal trade, stolen land, and rituals meant to secure wealth through spiritual means. On the night of the meeting, the society may have turned against them for breaking its rules. Instead of punishment through courts or politics, retribution came through disappearance, ensuring that no scandal would ever reach the public eye. A darker theory suggested that the men were victims of a supernatural curse tied to the land itself. Many enslaved people believed that certain rivers, swamps, and burial sites held the spirits of ancestors who did not forgive brutality. According to this belief, the lodge sat atop sacred ground disturbed years earlier during plantation construction. When the five gathered that night, they awakened something ancient and vengeful. The warped reflections in the river, the silent trees, and the vanishing footprints were all seen as signs that the spirits had claimed them. Some historians later speculated that betrayal from within their own circle led to their fate. One of the five may have orchestrated the meeting with the intention of eliminating the others. Hidden accomplices could have waited in boats along the river or concealed themselves in the marsh. In this version, greed, rivalry, and long-buried secrets tore the alliance apart. The disappearance was not mystical at all, but a calculated act of violence disguised as mystery.